Hi folks, this is David Birchall. I'm giving this week's lecture pod for Australian Politics and Active Citizenship for Spring 2020. There's two pods for this week. This is the first one. I've listed the content of both of the pods here. The other one you'll find up on Views as well on the same place. In this pod, which I've titled Why Do We Vote the Way We Do, I just want us to think about why we vote the way we do and what's the history of it. What does it mean to have elections in the way that we have them, and why is it so important to people that particular forms of voting are chosen rather than others? What does it mean to talk about the popular will being represented in an election? It's a complicated question. I'm not going to go into all the complications here, simply to try and outline some of the issues. On the right-hand side of the screen, there's a couple of images. The first, which I'll come back to, is from a series of prints and paintings by the 18th century British artist, English artist, William Hogarth, about elections in 18th century England. And what you'll see there on the right-hand side is a polling booth, 18th century English style, with the flags of the two main parties in the British Isles at the time, the Tories on the left and the Whigs on the right, the Orange people. The local candidates for the two parties are actually sitting in that booth, or kind of the place with the awning. And the voters in the front here had to sit down and mark their vote in public, being watched by other people. To us, a bizarre idea. Bottom right-hand corner, you can see an election being held in the Second World War in Australia using the system first called the Australian ballot, but subsequently called the secret ballot, which is what we're used to, of course, where you record your vote in secret and are discouraged from letting anyone else know how you vote. Okay, on to the rest of the subject of this lecture. It's just to remind us a few thoughts about democracy's beginnings. Democracy, the term, and the concept emerged in ancient Greece in around about the 5th, 6th centuries BC, BCE, although we find other forms of it in the ancient Mediterranean, including at Rome for a period of time, and even arguably in ancient Israel as well. But certainly in Greece and Athens in particular, democracy was an important part of their political histories. Democracy tended to come and go as a form of government. It had a reputation in the ancient world of not being stable enough, but it also had great political and emotional power in the understanding of Athenians of themselves as Athenians. The idea of the popular will being expressed through elections and through voting really has its beginnings in Athens. We don't exactly know why, actually. We don't exactly know why this mattered so much to the Athenians. They don't bother to explain, as in history so often people don't bother to explain the really important things that they take for granted. So as I said last week, democracy in the ancient world is a principle rather than a set of mechanisms. It's an idea rather than a particular way of doing things. It means the people, the rule of the many. Now, in ancient Athens, being a small city-state of only tens of thousands of people, of whom only probably a few thousand voted at any one time, democracy was face-to-face. You had to turn up in the assembly space. The speaker spoke from this rostrum, that's the Roman word for it, on the right-hand side of the screen. And the rest of the Athenian citizenry, such as was able to make it, was arrayed in front of them, listening and then casting votes when necessary. So the people, the meaning of the word the people, the demos, in Athens was those people who could assemble physically to debate and vote at any particular moment. And we know that probably no more than a quarter of the voting population of Athens could reasonably have fitted into the Athenian assembly, the ecclesia, which is about the size of a modest suburban rugby league football field. Voting was secret in ancient Athens, which is interesting because it's the way we do it, but it's not the way voting was done in elections for most of human history afterwards. But voting was only one system of democracy in Athens. More common in many respects was the practice of voting by lot. This is, by the way, voting chits for when you vote on a particular issue in the Athenian Assembly, but the decisions about who were to fill public offices, of which there were literally hundreds, was done by a randomizer system. That's a little analog computer there. People stuck in little chits and balls fell through and all sorts of wonderful things happened. At the end, you were supposed to get a random allotment of outcomes. It seems not to have been random in practice, since rich people seem to get appointed to offices more than poor people. We're not quite sure that was. I suspect the machinery had some interesting quirks. Even Athenian-style democracy, though it was face-to-face, produced a certain element of cynicism. We have the plays of the famous Athenian comic playwright Aristophanes to thank for this knowledge. His play The Wasps makes great fun of democracy junkies who can't stop getting themselves appointed to juries or obsessing about election results. We all know one of those. Historically speaking, it seems that this kind of democracy is really only suited to small, homogenous city-states. Direct democracy is hard to do on a huge scale. Also, it fell into disrepute because it was feared by elites, I think, that the people would misuse their power and oppress minorities, especially them. And so our democratic practices do not derive directly from the ancient Mediterranean, though our idea of democracy comes from there. Rather, our conceptions of voting and representation come from the 18th century, as we described last week, and as I'll talk more about next week. It was the parliaments, or parlement in French, or the estate general, as it was called in medieval France and other places, similar things, which form the ancestral models for our parliamentary political elections. In order to understand why we vote the way we do, it's important, I think, to understand the way people used to vote before Australia became a nation in 1901. The British system of the 19th century and earlier was fundamentally different ours in many respects, and in most respects it was not democratic at all. I think it's best to understand our system as a response to or a reaction against the deliberately undemocratic character of pre-modern elections. So, in the 18th century, second dot point there, British electoral systems were deliberately designed not to be democratic. Most people didn't have a vote. Probably only 10% of the population of Britain had a vote in the 18th and up until the middle of the 19th centuries. The great mass of men did not have the vote or couldn't make use of it, and no women at all, of course. There was a property qualification for voting. For 100 years or more, it was 40 shillings, which actually made it quite difficult for many men to vote. Women couldn't vote at all. That was by design. The idea was that unless you had a financial stake in the country, you couldn't be trusted with the vote. So women are not entitled to vote, and in Britain, they didn't vote till the 1920s. In many parts of Europe, not till after World War II. Likewise, in most parts of the world, women are still not able to vote in some countries in the Arabian Gulf to this day. Voters voted in public, as I said before, as in the Hogarth print. There was no secrecy, and so your employer or the local boss of the manor in the neighbourhood could watch how you voted, and so voting was not free by our standards at all. It was probably no freer than it is in some autocracies like Russia nowadays. Electorates were of wildly differing sizes. The whole of the north of England had a handful of electorates in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, while tiny bits of the south of England had a member of parliament each. There were no laws against bribery or inducements, and corruption was commonplace. Election banquets the night before, where a lot of alcohol was thrown at voters in order for them to vote for a certain person, were very common. Giving of gifts was equally common, and offers of jobs as well. And lastly, members of parliament weren't paid. It was a gentleman's job. If you needed to pay, you weren't the right person for the job. And so the same person often occupied a parliamentary seat for decades, possibly for their whole life. Australian democracy, electoral democracies, has emerged since Federation and before Federation. It's basically a series of responses to those undemocratic electoral practices. From the late 19th century, the electorate was increased to include all adult citizens, including women, and property qualifications were abolished. Multiple voting was also abolished, which had been possible in the British system. As in ancient Athens, as I've said before, voting became secret, first in South Australia in the 1850s and afterwards in all the colonies and states. And there are regular efforts made to ensure that electorates are more or less the same size, and even sometimes to try and make sure as far as possible they're of a similar kind of composition, to the extent that that's possible. Members of Parliament are paid a salary so that anyone in principle could become a Member of Parliament. It's a job. Of course, that itself becomes controversial. All of those were efforts to make the outcome of Australian elections match the views of a majority of citizens. And it's obviously been an important part of our sort of national culture for a long time. On the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see elections took place even during World War II, and enlisted members of the Australian Army took part in them, as you can see. Since the 1920s, Australia has been one of the few countries in the world to make voting compulsory, or that's a slightly controversial question legally. Are we actually required to vote, or merely to have our name crossed off in a polling booth? The legislation actually isn't very clear about that. As you can see, that's one of the earliest elections with compulsory voting. You can see the little notice for it on the right-hand side there. It talks about a penalty for failing to vote without a valid excuse of not exceeding £2, which was a lot more money then than the small amount of money people are fined nowadays is. And again, it seems to be assumed that it's voting that's compulsory, although of course you can't actually compel someone to cast a valid vote. Early supporters of compulsory voting supported it by arguing that voting was a sacred duty of citizens and that democracy required that everyone exercise their obligation to vote. So it wasn't a privilege or even in a sense a right, but rather an obligation or even in a sense a burden that we're required to exercise. Opponents of it then said it would strengthen the hand of party machines too much because they wouldn't have to worry about getting people out to vote, or to give too much sway to lazy people who otherwise couldn't be bothered to vote. And you'll still find those arguments, all of those arguments, going around today. It's not unique in the world, but we are one of the few countries to have legislation that makes voting compulsory and to take it seriously by actually genuinely fining people for not voting. Likewise, the preferential system of voting, common in lower houses across Australia, which is very unusual in the world again, is intended to ensure that every Member of Parliament, one way or another, can be said to have the support of the majority of electors, of voters. You can argue about that, but that's the theory. Together, the purpose of this system, if you like, as it's become, although it was an accidental system, there was no one moment where it was designed, is to maximise the legitimacy of governments, so that Australian governments, more than most governments in the world, can claim that a majority of people, and a majority of the people, voted for them in some way. Now, I'm going to leave off there, and you can pick up the story with the second pod.